I am now going to share my screen.
Теперь бы я хотел поделиться с вами своей презентацией, ее содержанием.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that.
Надеюсь, вы видите мои слайды.
I'm going to be talking about some work that we've been doing on B vitamins, on cognition and brain activity. Just so you know, this is my lab in Melbourne, and in sunny Melbourne here. This is the building we work in, and this illustrates some of the methodologies that we use, particularly brain imaging, which I'll be talking about in some detail. If you want to come and visit us, please do. We're always looking for collaborators, and you can please email me at this address here and look at my lab's work here, www.humanpsych.com. So why would we look at the influence of B vitamins on cognition and brain activity? Well, the answer lies partially with the effects of aging on cognition. So this is a graph showing some real data, showing what happens to the speed of processing as we get older. So you can see that starting from the age of 6 to 10, it increases, and as we hit midlife in our 20s, 30s, we peak, and then there's this decline in cognitive function, something that we understand at a number of levels, including at the level of networks, circuits, neurons, synapses, even molecules. But I'm very interested in the behavioral manifestation of this. So one of the aims of the research we're doing is to try and make this curve here slightly less steep, but also to optimize cognitive performance on a day-to-day level. And in doing this, my group and others have examined the impact of a number of plant extracts, which are listed here, other interventions, including multivitamins, which is what I'm going to focus on today. So I think it's worth saying that this decline with aging isn't inevitable. So this graph here shows individuals over a period of 6 years looking at two measures of mental function. One is working memory, a very important aspect of cognition, which I'll talk about later, and the speed of processing. And although you can see that there's a general downward trend, it's also true that there are some individuals who don't show this decline. So here you can see an individual who they were measured at 90. They had high functioning working memory, and they maintained that over into their mid to late 90s. And the same is true for perceptual speed here. And this is also true of brain areas. So later on, we'll be talking about two brain areas, the hippocampus and the cerebellum. And you can see that they, again, these are individuals who have had their volume of their cerebellum and hippocampus measured about 5 or 6 years apart. And you can see that there's a general downward curve in both of these structures. But there are other areas of the brain which show more variability and can show maintained function and even an improvement. So just again to make this absolutely clear, psychologists often talk about the types of cognitive function which decline with aging and those which are maintained with aging in terms of crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, which doesn't decline with aging, includes things like general knowledge, vocabulary, verbal ability, whereas tasks which are timed, where there's some time, speed of information processing, episodic memory, so remembering about episodes in your life, spatial abilities, and working memory, all show this general decline with aging. And here's a real example here. So this is a way which we might test something like spatial working memory in the laboratory. So you would sit in front of a computer, you'd be presented with a grid like this. Some of the squares have been blocked out. There'd be a gap of a couple of seconds, and then you would be presented with a number of stimuli like this, and you'd be asked whether or not was in the original array. So this one was, this one wasn't, etc. And if we look at the speed in which people are able to make that decision, we can see that it increases with age. In other words, people get slower with age on this specific task. Whereas if we look at a simpler task here, which is just pressing a button as quickly as possible, you can see there's very little cognitive decline. So as well as working memory, which is holding information, there are other aspects of cognition, attention, secondary memory. And one way in which I often use to explain is if you check into a hotel, then the first thing you do is you would use a concentrate on the receptionist and filter out bits of information that you're buying. You'd check in, you'd get your room number, and as you're going to your room, you know that you're going to have to remember that room number later, so you rehearse it over and over again. And when you do that, you're using your working memory. And then later, after you've been out for a meal or been to the bar, you have to retrieve your room number, and you use your secondary memory. That is, you retrieve it from the store. And this, of course, can be influenced by mood, by how happy, calm, alert you are, and also by executive function, which is a way in which these elements are organized. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just to show you that we have specific tasks which tap into these different elements. So we can now measure these using cognitive tools quite well. Here's an example. So I hope you will play along with me on this. So what I would like to do is I'd like you to read the following set of digits, and then when I say now, read them back to me. So here we go. Okay, can you read them back? Well, I can't actually hear anything, but I'm assuming that you all did very well. And if we were going to make that more difficult, I would ask you to read them backwards. So that would increase the working memory load. And this slide here just illustrates that these can be translated into everyday cognition. So when we think about attention, we think about concentration, staying on task for long periods of time. Distractibility is when attention goes wrong. Working memory is when you have to remember a new PIN for your credit card, or and it goes when you walk into a room and you forget why, or you start to dial somebody's phone number and then forget who you were dialing. Second birthday information, where a car is parked, and it goes wrong with the so-called tip of the tongue effect, where you're trying to remember, say, somebody's name, then you forget it. And then executive function is involved in multitasking and planning and in inhibiting inappropriate responses. And another reason this is quite important is that when we think about the extremes of cognitive impairment, such as Alzheimer's disease, here we know that this has its precursors in mild cognitive impairment, where people are not quite as bad as Alzheimer's, but many people, about 25% of people with MCI, will convert to Alzheimer's disease. And also subjective memory impairment, where people think that their memory is worse than it used to be, but actually perform somewhat better on cognitive tasks. And it may be that preventative interventions are best initiated even 30 to 40 years prior to this. And this is why we study things like diet and interventions with supplements to see if we can prevent this journey into Alzheimer's disease. And one of the reasons is that the current treatments for Alzheimer's, the cholinesterase inhibitors such as Aricept have been spectacularly unsuccessful. And as you're probably aware, they are fairly toxic to many people. They maybe by 3 to 6 months in those individuals with milder Alzheimer's disease who can tolerate them. And it may be that there are supplements which affect multiple systems and therefore can improve this and prevent this transition into Alzheimer's disease. And why? It's because cognitive aging is influenced by a number of other processes, such as how well you control your blood glucose, blood flow, by cardiovascular function, oxidative stress, inflammation, hormonal activity, psychological stress. Increasingly, we think that the gut microbiome may influence behavior, as well as neurotransmitters. So it may be that by influencing some of these factors indirectly, we may be able to improve cognitive function. So turning now to the studies on micronutrients, this slide illustrates that there's been a real explosion in the study of micronutrients and cognition over the last sort of decade or so. And here's just a few of them, some of which I've been involved with. This is a slide which from a study that was done by our postdoc Matt Parzay and a couple of other people in our lab, Helen McPherson and Andrew Papingas. It was a meta-analysis performed a few years ago on the existing studies on multivitamin supplementation and cognition. You can see that the meta-analysis showed that there was a significant effect on this immediate free recall. So something, so this is quite interesting, although as we'll see, it's not restricted to this particular domain. Here's another meta-analysis by Dave Benson's group in the UK. Here, showing again that when we look at mood symptoms, stress, mild psychiatric symptoms such as depression and anxiety and fatigue, overall, there is a favorable effect of multivitamins. And this is particularly the case when we look at preparations which are high in B vitamins rather than those which are lower in B vitamins and higher in minerals. So these particular studies that are just highlighted in. And this really harks back to a very prescient statement by the double Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling in 1974, who said that the genes for mental illness are likely the genes that regulate brain metabolism of essential nutrients. And in fact, recently, I was lucky enough to be one of many co-authors from a paper that was given by my colleague Jerome Saras here in the Lancet Psychiatry, arguing that we need to look at nutritional approaches to psychiatry. So what about our studies on B vitamins? Well, here's an example of the sort of tasks that we use in the laboratory, and this is typical of the sort of task which is impaired with aging. So here you with a series of pictures. Here we've got this mushroom, etc., cockerel, piece of fruit, a boat, and they are in different positions on the screen. So your task at retrieval will be to say, have you seen this before? And if you answer yes, you're then asked to say whereabouts you saw the picture before. So in this case, it would be here. And so this is not only remembering information, but also remembering aspects of the information. So the configuration in which you found it. And if we look here at a group of older men at risk of cognitive decline because they were sedentary and had a reasonably high BMI, and they were over 50, we look at the accuracy over 8 weeks of supplementation versus placebo here. We can see significant improvements in their cognitive abilities, and this wasn't masked by any change in speed. So this wasn't a speed accuracy trade-off. Another study along the same vein, looking at a B vitamin preparation on women aged 64 to 82. People, these were women with subjective memory impairment. So this specific condition which predisposes people to cognitive dysfunction later in life, in a 16-week intervention, again using the working memory task that I described earlier, you can see that there was a significant improvement in working memory. And the question often comes up about what does this mean? How meaningful are these sort of improvements? What does this kind of reduction in 50 milliseconds or whatever it is mean? Well, here is the data I showed you earlier. And if we superimpose the improvement due to multivitamins here onto this graph, what we see is an improvement of 6.5 years. In other words, the multivitamin preparation over 16 weeks is taking these people back to the cognitive performance they would have 6.5 years ago. And I think for most people at that age, if you said we can take your memory back to where it was 6 or 7 years ago, most people would think that was a pretty significant improvement. What about earlier in life? Well, again, these were people who were 20 to 50 years old, randomized to a 16-week cognitive trial, placebo or an active multi-B vitamin. And I'm just going to talk about one aspect of this. This was just part of the study where, at the end of the study, before we unblinded the data, we asked the individuals to just state one positive or any negative mental and physical effects that they noticed while they were on the trial. And when we then unblinded the data, we found that the people in the multivitamin group had significantly improved mood and emotion, significantly better sleep, and significantly improved energy and alertness. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk about acute versus chronic effects. So in the acute studies, we use something called the cognitive demand battery. So again, if you were part of this study, you'd be sitting in front of a computer like this. A random number will be generated onto the screen here, and your task would be, first of all, to undergo computerized serial 3. So you repeatedly subtract 3 from a random number like this until the number disappears after the first time you make a response. And the same thing but with serial 7s. So you'd be subtracting 7 from a random starting number. Then a task called RVIP, which I'm going to talk about again. So this is a very difficult working memory task where you would be presented with single digits on the screen, one after the other, at a fairly rapid rate, so about 100 per minute, so kind of that sort of rate. And what your task is to press a button if you see 3 consecutive even or 3 consecutive odd numbers. So here's 3 consecutive odd numbers. So you press the button there and then keep going. And this is very, very cognitively demanding. When we look at this whole, and then people ask, how mentally fatigued do you feel? And you can see that what happens is that we present this little 10-minute battery over and over again. So over the course of an hour, we repeat the battery over and over again. And as you might expect, what happens then is that you get a significant increase in mental fatigue coupled with a significant decrease in performance. And there's some interventions which seem to protect against that by increasing fatigue and increasing performance. So, sorry, I've got to let me just get rid of that. then what happens here is this is a study looking at this particular effect, but looking at a study using or a preparation, B vitamin preparation with guarana, which contains a caffeine-like substance, and you can see significantly reduced mental fatigue and significantly improved performance on this very mentally demanding RVIP, so this odds and even numbers task. This is, we then went on to see if that effect might be due to the effects of the caffeine in guarana. So we compared the guarana containing preparation with a non-guarana containing preparation. This was actually Barocca, and I should say, by the way, that this was for transparency, this study was sponsored by Bayer, and so we compared placebo with Barocca Boost and Barocca Performance, which I believe is sold as Barocca Plus in Russia. And this was the study, 20 healthy young adults who came in on 3 visits. They took this preparation in randomized order. They underwent this cognitive demand battery and also 2 aspects of neuroimaging, which I'll talk about. So here was the structure of the study. So they were tested at baseline and then 30 minutes post-treatment. We tested their mood using the Bond-Lader mood visual analog scales here. So you can see that in this task, what happens is that you make a mark just on how your current mood is, and on these lines which are anchored by opposites, and it generates 3 outcomes: alert, calm, and content. We also asked people how stressed and fatigued they felt. And what you can see is that when people undergo the test battery, as you would expect, there's a negative mood. So this is contentment, or sometimes called hedonic tone. You can see that it goes down both at baseline and following the treatment, apart from in the Barocca Boost condition here, where you get this significant improvement in contentment or protection. And this is actually very in keeping with what we know about guarana. So here's another study showing the same effects of guarana in a dose. I think that those effects are due to guarana. But what was interesting was when we started to look at the brain imaging. So just to be absolutely clear, what we mean by brain imaging is the participant is presented with stimuli, actually often in the scanner, and so the test stimuli are presented. They activate the brain, and we record the response using either the electrical or metabolic signal. And really what we're trying to determine is where and when these occur in relation to specific types of tasks. And this is basically, this is determined by a methodology of spatial resolution and its temporal resolution. What do we mean by that? Well, basically different tasks have different spatial and temporal resolution, and that can either be better towards this axis or worse. And if we look at fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, very commonly used, we can see that actually the spatial resolution is good. That is, we can probably measure now about a cubic millimeter of activation in the brain. The temporal resolution is not great. So here we've got about a second. We're averaging over about a second. Whereas with EEG, which records electrical signals, we've got much better spatial resolution. We can actually pick up millisecond events, although the temporal resolution is quite poor. We don't really know where the activation is coming, partly because the signal is smeared by the skull. So in our study, we used a specific type of EEG called steady state topography, which uses steady state VEPs. I won't go into too much detail of this, but what happens is the participant sits with these goggles on their head. These play a 13 hertz, 13 times a second flicker, and this flicker sets up a reverberation in the brain, in the cortex, and that reverberation is very sensitive to both the effects of specific cognitive tasks and the effects of specific interventions, including nutritional interventions. So in this particular task here, this is another example of a spatial working memory task. The participant fixates on this cross. They're then presented with an array of dots, a bit like this, for half a second. There's a hold period for, say, 3 seconds here, and then they're presented with a probe saying, was there a dot in this position, or this position, or this position, or this position? And you can imagine that actually most of the work occurs here when you're trying to remember exactly where those dots were over the last second or so. And this gives two different measures, amplitude and latency. So, and these index different things. So I'm going to talk about these a little bit later, but you can see how they change when we have a high or low working memory load. With Barocca performance, or Barocca Plus, as you call it, this is what we found. I'm just going to play a video now, which I hope will show you. So this is a recording of the brain during that working memory task with the various, so I'm just going to pause it there so you can see. Here's the fixation cross. Now what you're going to look for here is a burst of activation which occurs across the frontal lobes here as we move into that hold period where you're trying to remember the location of the dots. So here we've got the encoding, then suddenly there's a hold period, and look what happens here. This big wave of activation across the frontal lobes here, going up, up, up. Here we go, getting more significant, and then it will die down again as we reach the end of the stimulus presentation. So what does that mean? Well, what we got there was an increase in amplitude, which suggests that the brain is working more efficiently. It's higher efficiency of the circuits in the brain which require information to be held online. And let me again just emphasize that this was just in the half an hour or so following a single dose of this B vitamin preparation. What do we mean by increased neural efficiency? Well, when we think about the neural resources, the resources of the brain, they can either be used to increase performance, or they can be used to reduce effort. So if you can maintain the same level of performance while actually using fewer resources, that's an enhancement, and that's what we think is happening in the case of this B vitamin preparation. What about when we look at the fMRI data? Well, if you remember, it's this odds and evens task here, and what we find is, compared to a control task where people just had to press a button every time they saw a 0, I think, you can see that the areas that light up are predominantly these parieto-frontal areas, which we know are involved in working memory, and also the cerebellum, so this area at the back of the brain, which is involved in attention and executive function. And then if we look at particularly the vitamins plus guarana, we hit the working memory task, and the multivitamin, the Barocca Plus versus placebo, specifically seems to activate the cerebellum, this area that's involved in attention and some aspects of executive function. So there's effects of both treatments, and one thing that's important is it means that we know that these B vitamins are getting into the brain within half an hour to an hour of taking a single dose, and in fact influencing brain activity. We know that probably the behavioral effects are to do with guarana in this case, following an acute dose, but that there is greater neural efficiency for this multivitamin preparation, which also targeted this executive function pathway. Okay, what about the longer term effects? Well, this was a study which we have completed quite recently. This was supplementation with Berocca Performance or Berocca Plus or placebo, randomized, double-blind, 58 18 to 40-year-olds. They had a practice day. They came in, did some cognitive tests, had snapshots of mood taken, had bloods taken, had fMRI. Then every day for 4 weeks, they took a dose of B vitamins or B vitamins and minerals or a placebo. And then after 4 weeks, they underwent exactly the same set of tests. And this is what we found. So as you would expect, the bloods responded, although I should say these were healthy individuals. So we got increased B6, increased B12, increased red cell folate, and a reduction in homocysteine, which of course is a good indicator of increased antioxidant capacity. Higher homocysteine is a bad thing. If we look at the mood effects, the most significant effect was a significant reduction in depression, dejection, which you can see here, which again is in line with a lot of the literature on mood benefits of cognition. But remember, this is in healthy individuals. These aren't psychiatric patients. And if we look at the brain activation, again using this SST, this is the placebo, looking at the change from baseline to follow-up. This is the Berocca change from baseline to follow-up. So I'm not going to labor these graphs, but this is the most significant difference here. So in this case, what we're getting is increased activation in this parieto-frontal pathway, which we know is associated with attention and working memory. So increased activation. And this was absolutely consistent with the effects in fMRI. So these were quite beautiful effects where again you can see that compared to placebo, we're getting activation in these parieto-frontal regions. This, I should make very clear, was only in the group who were mentally fatigued. So this was specific to the group who had undergone SST, which is a very demanding procedure. So in the people who are fatigued, this B vitamin supplementation, Berocca Plus, improved activation in a working memory circuit in the brain. Okay, so finally, just to finish off, why do we think this is the case, or why is this significant? Well, one reason might be to do with something called neurocognitive scaffolding. Neurocognitive scaffolding refers to the strategies that the brains of successfully aging people have. So people who age successfully in terms of their cognitive function tend to use more frontal recruitment, tend to use more distributed processing, so they use greater areas of the brain. They exhibit more neurogenesis, so the growth of new nerve cells, and more bilaterality, using both sides of the brain. And when we look at what the effects of multivitamin supplementation is, it does fit in very well with this. There's frontal recruitment, there's distributed processing, and there's more bilaterality. So this suggests that B vitamin supplementation may help to support cognitive scaffolding in aging, as well as being a successful intervention for individuals who have memory problems or just want to increase their mood and their general cognitive function. What are the mechanisms? So as we said, these are the kind of factors which affect cognitive aging, and you know, these are realistic, as we said, nutritional supplementation targets. In terms of B vitamins, we know that they improve cardiovascular function, they counter oxidative stress, they have anti-inflammatory properties, and they reduce psychological stress. So this might be how they are influencing cognitive function. And there's also one consideration, which is that these were healthy young adults in most of the studies. They weren't deficient in any vitamins at all. They may have been slightly deficient, we don't know. And there is an idea that perhaps these effects will be more profound in people who have suboptimal vitamin status or vitamin insufficiency, as it's been termed. But just to conclude, B vitamin micronutrient treatments impart a number of behavioral benefits on a number of populations. They're evident even in high functioning young adults. We don't know the effects of initial nutrient status, although I think it's worth noting that there were these positive, healthier shifts in B vitamins, folates, and homocysteine associated with supplementation. And we know that the central mechanism include increased activation of circuits, including the ones implicated in cognitive aging. Thank you very much. Here are some of the people in our lab, and here are some of the people whose work I've presented today for you. Thank you very much.
Speaking about the dosage which was used, could you specify on that?
Yes, so most of the studies in this area suggest that something which is at or above the recommended daily average. So the recommended RDIs across the broad spectrum of vitamins and nutrients seem to be the most effective.
Could you kindly tell us, is there any limitation by age in Berocca and Berocca Plus application? And for what time period a positive effect is sufficient? How does long it last? And Berocca Plus, does the impact on aged patients on their blood pressure?
I'm afraid I don't know the information on blood pressure. I'm not aware of any data. Most of the studies in older individuals suggest that these effects emerge by 8 weeks. So most of the studies are 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, where the effects are evident. I'm not aware of any studies looking at acute effects in the elderly, and there may be something there.
Could you kindly tell us, mental fatigue, what do you mean? There's a From's term for that? Importance or something like that. And my second question, well, yes, please answer.
Okay, yeah, so it's an excellent question. So many mood scales distinguish between physical fatigue and mental fatigue. So rather than the sort of fatigue which is to do with simply, you know, muscle fatigue or feeling physically weak, this is mental fatigue, so it impacts on, it's more of a negative mood state rather than a physical state. In this case, it was just a single item. So mental fatigue was just a single item. You know, how mentally fatigued do you feel? Not at all, extremely. But other scales have a few items that tap into it. So work using something like the shoulder fatigue scale has shown some similar effects. Does that answer your question?
Себя? Это отвечает на ваш вопрос? Well, you disappeared from the screen. I'm sorry. Could you bring yourself back? Well, one more question: whether you measured the Berocca impact on depersonalization? If not, potentially, how can Berocca impact on depersonalization, please?
I'm not aware of any studies which have looked at that, so I wouldn't like to speculate. Sorry.
Да.
I mean, it would be a really interesting thing to look at, but I'm not aware of anything.
Could I ask my question? Hello. Hello. Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your report. I have several questions to ask you. The first one is, what analogs of a Duke rating scale could you recommend to... Hello again. To ask you, the first one is how to change the analog fatigue scale, how to remove it, with what are the instruments if we want to test the subjects who are intended to hide their symptoms, not to reveal the symptoms of cognitive decline. The second one is what biomarkers could you recommend to use during research of cognitive decline, like maybe cortisol, levels of cortisol, and so on. Another is concerned how was defined the period of your acute study, the period of intervention? It was 4 weeks. Why? Is it the period for Berocca to walk, or some other criteria influence this period? And the last one, I would like to ask you to show the first slide with your email to photocopy it.
Okay. I will do that. So the first question was about what do we do about people who are hiding their cognitive decline, and I think the answer is that that's quite difficult unless you have access to very standardized cognitive tests, particularly computerized tests, which tend to be much more sensitive. So it's very hard for people to hide both speed and accuracy of their impairment, I think. So that's you know, there are tests out there which things like CDR, CANTAB, which have very well established aging norms, which you can map individual responses against. And the second question is one that I get asked quite a lot. So what's a good biomarker for cognitive aging? And the answer is we don't have one. There isn't something that you can just take a blood test and say, well, this person is, should show cognitive decline. There's clearly there are different processes which we know impinge on cognitive decline, and there's a whole cluster of metabolic type disorders which we know are risk factors for cognitive decline, as they are for many other systemic kind of disorders. So if we think about the so-called metabolic disorder, metabolic syndrome, poor glucoregulation, high triglycerides, high BMI, high waist circumference, that will impact on cognitive function in the same way that it will on other aspects of systemic health. And these are biological systems which of course can't be separated. So if somebody presents to you and says that they've got memory problems, and you know that, for example, you suspect they have high levels of systemic inflammation, for example, then there may be a clue there. But there isn't just a single biomarker which correlates very well with cognition. The final question, I think, was how long does it take for these effects to emerge? And the answer is that we were absolutely astonished by our initial studies showing that we were getting effects within an hour or two of a single dose, particularly in brain imaging. And yeah, the received wisdom is that with vitamin supplementation, one requires weeks, maybe even longer, to get the effects. But we've shown, and other people have shown, that these effects can become apparent very quickly, and these are even in quite healthy young individuals. So I suspect that these broad spectrum multivitamin preparations are maybe just increasing metabolism, acutely being incorporated into metabolic pathways. It's a very under-researched area, but and then we have the longer term effects which we see following supplementation for many weeks, and these, as I said before, tend to emerge after 8 weeks or so, and I suspect that those, maybe 4 or 8 weeks, and I suspect that they are targeting different mechanisms. So and really we don't know. We're just beginning to scratch at the surface as to what those mechanisms are. And for your final question, I think if I can get this right, here is my here's my email address. So the best one is this one, andrew@scholylab.com. I hope you can see that. Okay, are there any more questions?
One more question. People who are involved in the hazardous professions like drivers, locomotive drivers, should I recommend Berocca? And what kind of probability that their professional functions will not be jeopardized?
Okay, look, that's a very good question. The answer is that a number of studies have shown that various B vitamin preparations have a positive effect on workplace stress. If that's what you're talking about, in most cases, I would say that these are not, there aren't side effects are very, very rare. We've, you know, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of people we've tested with various B vitamin preparations, not just Berocca, but others. Berocca is what the research that I showed you today. Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a kind of insurance policy. So it will kind of prop up various aspects of mood and cognitive function. But I think this is very different to if you're talking about people with severe kind of psychiatric or very severe stress and anxiety. You know, these might help, but they may need something, you know, some sort of something more of a full clinical intervention. I'm not a clinician. I'm you know, I'm a scientist, so I can only speak about the data that I'm aware of.
Professor Scholey, now we will continue, and in the end we will have the session of question and answers. And it's absolutely correct that he tried to switch to clinical aspects and perhaps speaking about depression and personalizations and the state of alert. I'm a psychiatrist, and I could elaborate a little bit more with a more professional approach. And I could talk about problematics, why this topic has been touched upon in the Therapeutical Congress, and now we'll hear the stories how you could use the therapy by vitamins for prophylaxis, to strengthen this therapy by other drugs. Все закончили? Andrew, thank you very much for your input. This is Sergey, the interpreter, on behalf of the whole audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.